Today we're going to be breaking down some hands that I played in my recent heads-up match over at the Lodge versus TJ Reid. We've got 4 or 5 hands we're going to jump into. Some of them I'm going to just be talking like this to you directly in the camera. A couple of them I'll pull up some simulations so we can look at some nerdy stuff and give you a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Hopefully lots of information here to up your game for free. So hope you enjoyed this, guys. My favorite form of poker. I think I have a lot to teach. Let's go ahead and jump into some hands.
And a pocket pair here for Notorious TJ, 3-betting the 450. Not the start he's looking for 22 hands into the show. Doug's not going to trap. TJ doing some inventory on his stack. Might just get it in. Makes the call.
First hand of the match we're going to be talking about, we have pocket aces, about 145 big blinds effective, or 140 big blinds effective. We opened up aces. TJ now has pocket sevens. Sevens is a hand that likes to mix between both options. You can certainly go for the call. You can also go for the 3-bet. As you get deeper, it likes to 3-bet a bit more often. As you get more shallow, it does a bit more calling. But nonetheless, I think that this hand can certainly go into either range. He decides to 3-bet it, which is fine. Now over to me with aces. I don't really like to trap aces all that often. I don't mind mixing it in against some players that are particularly aggressive. But in my time looking at a lot of poker situations, aces tends to just like to raise. So we want to go ahead and 4-bet and build this pot. As you get more shallow, aces does like to trap a bit more because it's more likely your opponent improves to something that can continue. And it's also less bad to just pot control. For example, if you're hundreds of blinds deep, you're really not going to want to trap aces. You want to get as much money in as you possibly can. But on 140 big blinds, I'd still lean towards always 4-betting. But I don't mind putting in a call against players you might consider to be a bit more aggressive. Facing a 4-bet with pocket sevens, I think TJ should mainly call. You really don't ever fold pairs when you 3-bet them in heads up. If you 3-bet and your opponent 4-bets, you either jam or call. And I think you mainly call. Some things to think about with jamming. When you do jam, you kind of want to unblock some hands that might 4-bet bluff and fold to the jam. So typically speaking, some of your lowest pairs that 3-bet might make some nice 5-bet jam bluffs because you unblock some of the hands that might want to be bluffing. So typically speaking with these pairs, they're going to mix, but they're mainly going to call, which TJ does decide to do. And let's take a flop.
Check. That's 525.
Small bet from Doug. The worst flop for a pair of sevens, so TJ's going to come along way behind.
The flop comes Jack 5-4 flush draw. This is an interesting board because some players might think this is a very dry board. But actually, when you look at the hands that would 4-bet or 3-bet call a 4-bet, there are actually a lot of hands that connect here. If either player has a suited wheel ace, they either have a pair or gutter. So ace 5, ace 4, ace 3, ace deuce, all hands that can continue. If either player has 7-6 suited or 8-7 suited or 8-6 suited, those hands all obviously have straight draws. Club hands have flush draws. Diamond hands have backdoor flush draws. The out of position player will have lots of middling pairs, so lots of hands that can continue versus a bet. And then of course suited jacks, ace jack. A lot of hands that can call the 4-bet here that connect with this board. And then for the 4-betting player, you have most of those same hands, some offsuit variants, and then of course the over pairs that the big blind's not going to have. So this is a board that both players actually connect with a decent amount. Because of that, you probably do want to be building in some checks into your check back range here. And you want to be a little bit more polarized when you do bet, even for the very small size. Now, I don't think you're making a particularly gigantic error if you go ahead and just bet your range here. It does kind of come down to the way that both players are constructing their ranges pre-flop. And if you just want to simplify your life, that seems fine. The downside is you are actually going to get check raised here more than you probably would imagine. The reason being that there are lots of draws, lots of top pairs, lots of hands that like to raise. for the big blind. So I think that checking some hands here, particularly hands that are vulnerable against check raise, some hands like pocket tens, some hands perhaps like ace, maybe like ace king of hearts where you don't want to get check raised. Things like that can really make some sense to check back in pot control. You can balance that out by checking back some very strong hands too. Hands like pocket jacks are a very nice check back. I don't mind checking back some occasional hands like aces or ace jack where you have a high diamond. But when you have black aces like this, unblocking both the flush draws, this is the kind of hand you're certainly going to want to just bet and build the pot. Typically speaking, in these spots, when you 4-bet and they call, 20% pot is a totally fine bet size, which is what we decided to go for. And now to TJ with pocket sevens. You know, these spots get really weird. The solver actually does not mind check raising this kind of hand. Typically speaking, in 4-bet pots, when you do check raise, you're going to go for a very small size. And you might be thinking, this seems suicidal. Why would I check raise here? I lose to all the high pairs. And there certainly is some merit to that. But the idea is that you knock out a bunch of hands with equity. For example, if I have king queen or king 10 or queen 10 or ace 10, those types of hands really hate getting check raised because now they're probably going to mainly fold, maybe float if they have a high diamond. But pocket sevens can knock out all of the equity of those hands and then kind of isolate more, or rather define your opponent's range a little bit more clearly. It doesn't feel great to me. I know that we do this because the solver says so. In my opinion, it feels incredibly silly to bloat a pot with a pair like that. But at the end of the day, I'm sure the solution makes sense. And it does let us get some value from hands like ace, king, ace, queen that can call this check raise. I went through on my own to check the solver for what sevens would do on the turn when check raising. And you're mainly just checking the turn and then deciding based on the board. But you do continue barreling when you turn a straight draw. So it's a way of trying to realize your equity as well. But back to the hand, that's not what happens here. We don't face a check raise. We face a check call, which is definitely standard. If you don't raise, you do want to call. Let's go ahead and take a turn.
Great card to 7.
Check.
And now only a 7 as both players have 2 pair. Four-bet pot. Doug doesn't have to worry about too many 4s in TJ's range. Perhaps 5's full or Jack's full, but Doug's going to take his chances absolutely with the pair of bullets.
Looks like about 2,000. 1,600, so a little less than half size pot here.
Yeah, setting himself up nicely for a river jam if it gets to that point.
TJ just with 5,200 behind.
Yeah, awkward position for TJ.
Call.
Makes the call.
Pairs are hard to make.
So TJ looking for a black 7. A 7 from heaven?
The turn comes a very dry offsuit 4 pairing the board. We are now feeling awesome with our pocket aces. And this is actually a card that TJ is probably at least somewhat happy to see. Not another overcard. If his opponent, or rather if I'm bluffing, then I've not improved. Yeah, some occasional ace 4, 4-3 suited, 4-6 suited might be in there. But generally speaking, this brick is going to be a card that not a lot of hands have improved on. That said, now when I have a value bet, my equity is quite locked up. It's hard for him to improve to beat me. So not an amazing hand with pocket sevens here, but certainly not a terrible card either. TJ checks, and now I think with pocket aces, I don't hate the idea of trapping the turn with aces some in these situations. I would probably tend to do it a little bit more when I do have that high diamond. Basically, when I have a high diamond, it's less likely that he has the kind of hand, like a nut flush draw type hand, that will continue versus a bet. So when I have these overpairs with no diamond, I typically just lean towards barrel. That said, I think kings and queens would pretty much always be barreling here. And with aces, I don't mind mixing in some traps even without the diamond. So the question is, what size do we want to go? We have pot left behind, but we want to use a geometric size, which means bet a percent of pot here. That sets up a roughly equivalent river jam. I think in that spot, anything from around 1,400 to 2K, they're all pretty reasonable sizes. We go for 1,600, which seems totally fine. It does make the river bet a little bit bigger than the turn bet, but I don't think it's a very big deal. Now for TJ pocket sevens, it's getting pretty difficult. I really don't like the fact that he has the 7 of diamonds. or the 7 of hearts. The suits on his 7s are not particularly good to call the turn. However, given the size of the bet, you're probably going to have to just call. I think that in this situation, when you have pairs, there are simply too many other hands that might want to consider bluffing here. So it becomes a very difficult situation to let go of hands like pocket 7s and still be able to defend enough of your range where your opponent can't profitably bluff you. So in this situation with pocket 7s, I'm starting to lean towards fold. And I think specifically when we have certain combinations of 7s, we could lean towards a fold. But we are right on that cusp here. I don't mind either way. But I would like to make one note about this. As you can see here for TJ with 7s, lots of tough spots in a row, right? Pre-flop to 3-bet, it's close to 3-bet, or call, you should mainly 3-bet. Versus 4-bet, it's close. You should re-raise some, you should mainly call. On the flop, it's close. You should mainly call, you should do a bit of raising. On the turn, it's very close. You should mainly call, you should do some folding. And I think the important thing to take away here is you sort of need to be putting 7s into all of those lines a bit, because then you're going to end up facing this river jam less often with pocket 7s. I think people sometimes get a bit too much in the mindset of, I'm just going to check call this down, which again is fine. I mean, 7s is not a bad hand to check call by any means. But by putting 7s into all these other lines, you end up in this exact spot with a little less pocket 7s and a little more hands that are strong enough to call river, or perhaps draws that could improve. Anyway, certainly fine to check call. TJ does, and let's take the river.
Does not come.
Check.
And the jam's coming from Doug. And you're just praying. Am I good with my 2 pairs, 7s and 4s if you're TJ?
All in.
All in.
Show one.
We're not showing.
We were just talking about you being spewy on string games.
The river comes in offsuit 9. TJ checks again. We decide to jam with aces. Not too interesting. And then back to pocket 7s. Once again, a very difficult spot here with pocket 7s. I think in this situation, 7s is slightly bad because you do block some bluffs. You block 8-7 suited. You block 7-6 suited. Maybe a few other kind of random 7x bluffs, but probably not too many of those. But more importantly, you also do not block any value. One of the nice things about having a hand that's like King Jack, Queen Jack, Ace Jack, those hands all block some over pair type hands or some top pair type hands. So realistically in this situation, your removal with pocket 7s is not great. That said, I think that typically in these spots, solvers will mix in some calls, because if you're going to call, fold this, you probably end up with too many folds. Once again, this is why it's important 7s goes into some of these other ranges, because then you don't end up taking this line too often with pocket 7s. But regardless, I think the solution for 7s here is going to be sometimes call, sometimes fold. Probably lean fold, but I also do not mind calling down, and I'm sure it happens some at equilibrium. Could also be some game flow stuff here, some reads. Typically speaking, I've been a little bit aggressive in 4-bet pots on some of these shows. I do try to stay pretty balanced when I 4-bet, but of course, I'm a human being and no one is perfect. So it is possible I'm over bluffing here. In which case, if your opponent's over bluffing and you call, fold 7s, you kind of get owned. So I would say that in this situation, typically speaking, if it's close between 2 actions and you think your opponent may be an aggro idiot, it's probably best to call, although sometimes you are going to get the bad news.
Doug doesn't really have a great track record of talking in big hands, so
Makes the call, and TJ's going to get stacked for the first time today.
Not even the ace of diamonds.
Nice hand.
no response from Doug, and he gets the maximum.
So $10,000 will come back on the table for TJ.
Gonna give me 5, please.
Yeah, I got you.
The next hand we're going to break down is a fun one of the more interesting hands from the match. But before we jump into it, if you want to learn heads-up poker from me and my good friend Fabian Adler, my heads-up coach, we released a course about a year ago called the End Boss System. Learn how to play heads-up at the absolute peak level. If you execute the strategy in that course at a high level, you could beat almost anyone in the world. We break down every spot to heads up poker. Look, I know heads up poker, not the most popular game type, but it's going to be useful in a lot of different situations that can come up. You never know when you end up in a high stakes heads up 200-400 grudge match battle. It does happen more than one would think. Anyway, if you want that discount, it is heads up to 50. I'll put some information in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump into the next hand.
Yeah, but Jungle's response was also really aggressive.
Yeah.
So I mean,
And he said something like a commentate off. I don't understand what that was. Just settle this.
the whole thing struck me as interesting and a little off, but whatever.
125.
I must have missed that on
Yeah, because you're
the
not
Twitter
I like both
verse.
those guys.
You're not on
I'm
Twitter.
Surprised to see.
Not a big
I
Twitter
was
guy.
surprised to see that on.
Raised to 400.
Could be an interesting hand here, right? So we got the open-ended 6 high for Doug. TJ does have the ace of clubs. Ace high could be good here a number of the time, and it is.
Here we are going to be a little over 200 big blinds deep. We're about 240 blinds deep. So we're going to go ahead and use the trainer here, Lucid Trainer, to break down some of this hand. Pre-flop is simple enough. It just begins with an open on the button from TJ, and then we are in the big blind with 6-4 offsuit. 6-4 offsuit actually a fold. I wasn't sure in session because I'm getting a little rusty. I actually mixed this pre-flop. I think I actually folded 6-4 in this match, and I defended it a couple of times as well. So I wasn't sure. It was on the cusp. And look, like the reality is 7-5 offsuit is a defend. 6-4 offsuit is not, or rather 7-5 is a mix. So one notch lower, really not the end of the world. Anyway, the question is, do we ever want to 3-bet this hand? And the answer to that is probably no. Maybe once in a blue moon at equilibrium. But we decided to just call, and we take a flop. Jumping now into the trainer here as we go through, we can see that this is the defend range. 7-5 off is a mix. 6-4 off is a basically pure fold. It likes calling it like once in a blue moon, but just one notch too low here off the cusp of the defend range. Anyway, regardless, once we have raise and call, we can punch in the board here, which is going to be King 5-3 with a flush draw. I also want to note this is a 5% rake sim capped at 0.3 big blinds, so that's a little different than our non-raked format, but the outputs will end up being relatively similar. All right, so we're going to go ahead and look at the King 5-3 board here. We can see King 5-3, the 5 and 3, same suit. Slightly different suits here, but same principle. Big blind checks range, and now we see what the small blind c-bet range looks like. So 71% of the time you're going to bet here. This is a good board for the small blind, and TJ does decide to bet on the flop, although he decides to go for a half pot size. Half pot, not really the best size to pick here on this board generally. You can see the solver really likes using the smaller size at a high frequency. So we're going to just punch in the smaller size here, but we will note that that makes our defend range slightly tighter when looking at later streets. So we use the small, or he used the small size rather, and then this is what our range looks like in the big blind when we face this strategy. We can see 6-4 is primarily check raising here on the flop. We see it raising, something like 75% of the time or so. 6-4 gains a lot by raising. Typically speaking on this board, when you raise 6-4, anytime he folds, you're going to be in a pretty good spot because you're knocking out hands that were almost certainly better showdown value than you. And it makes your life pretty straightforward on turns and rivers. You can barrel when you get there. You can bluff on some runouts. Basically, it takes control of the pot, knocks out a bunch of equity, and then when you do get there, it's to the nuts on both sides. Because he used half pot and not this 1/3 pot, we actually would probably check raise this a little less often. It might be more like half the time. But the point remains that we are going to be check raising, and in game, I decided to check raise this about half the time, if I remember correctly. So we decide to make it a check raise here. We go up to about $500 here. Actually, sorry, $400 here. The smaller check raise size. We actually use a size in between these two raises. So we're going to just punch one in here that's the more common one, which is that small raise size to keep the range a little more compact. And then let's look at how TJ responds. So when facing this check raise, ace of clubs, 9 of hearts, you are always continuing this. And it's kind of obvious, right? If you fold hands that have the ace of clubs in them, you're going to be folding way, way, way too many hands. I mean, look how often you just have like 10-9 off, right? You have so many other hands to fold here. So pretty much a clear-cut call. I'm going to note There is some bet 3-bet that happens on this flop. As check raise sizes get bigger, you can play your entire range out of just calling the check raise. As check raise sizes get smaller, it is important to bet 3-bet. And I'm going to give you a pretty cool tip here. You can see the solver likes. If you take away nothing else from this video, you take away this one. Whenever you have your bottom pair and you face a check raise, if you want to just 3-bet and blast it off to the moon, it's a really nice hand to do that with, because your main value bet you want to go nuts with is bottom set. So when you have the suited variant of the bottom pair or the set, you can just go crazy with those two hands. And then you'll also have some more value bets like middle set, a little bit of top set, although typically that likes to call more. And basically you're always going to have some bluffs here. So basically next time you get check raised and you want to have a bet 3-bet range, your go-to 3-bet and barrel should be that bottom pair. Okay. All right. Now you guys can do something really spewy and blame me later. Anyway, with ace 9, you are going to always call. TJ does decide to call, and let's take a turn.
No longer.
Wow. Doug, second time he's
Hit
had the
these.
nuts straight. Already dealt 101 hands. Moving right along. Getting about 100 hands an hour.
TJ, a very creative player in his own right here, right? So he's got the straight draw that's no good. He probably thinks maybe if he hits his ace, that could be good.
Deuce of spades here on the turn, or deuce of diamonds in the sim we're looking at. So in this situation now, 2 flush draws out there. Very good card. Obviously, we have the nuts. A lot of our hands actually have improved here. Ace 4 check raising the flop sum. It gets there. 6-4 gets there. If we check raised a hand with a 6 or a 4 in it, we now have a draw. If we check raise the backdoor flush draw, we now have the backdoor flush draw. So a lot of hands that are good or have equity here to where we're going to want to be pretty aggressive in continuing to barrel in this spot. The solver does like to use some block, and it does like to use some 2/3 pot. Oh, it doesn't really like to use a bigger size than that. I would say in these spots, typically speaking, when you check raise and you get a call, in a spot where the board changes that is neutral or bad for you and you want to barrel, I would say you want to use a block size. When the board changes in a way that is neutral to good for you-ish, I would say you want to use roughly a 2/3 pot size. So I don't really mind going with either option. I could see some logic to both, and you can see the solver actually likes using both of those sizes. Here we go for the 2/3 pot size, the bigger size on the turn, because I think this turn is a little bit better for the player check raising. And so I'm going to play 2/3 pot or check. I don't split my range until the river. I don't want to go into that conversation though, because it's going to take way too long for a YouTube video. So we bet 2/3 pot. 6-4 specifically, by the way, you can see that it's mainly barreling the turn, a little bit of checking the double check raise. But typically speaking, we're going to go ahead and just barrel this turn. Now, this is where I think TJ makes a little bit of a mistake. Ace 9 is actually not a defend here versus this barrel. And I think the reason is because you actually want me to have a club at this point. If I have the nut flush draw, if I have a middling flush draw, those are some of my key bluffs. You're quite dead versus most of the value. And then this turn, a lot of my hands get there or now have improved equity. So I would say when you face this barrel, you really want to continue when you have, for example, a 6 in your range, a 6, a 4, a flush draw, those types of hands, obviously a pair. And there's something else interesting that's happening here. You can see that 11% of hands raise the turn here. And the reason I think that that's happening is because the big blind is not supposed to have 6-4 offsuit, but the small blind is. Now, back in reality, because I don't know my defend range pre-flop, I actually can also have 6-4. So if I put that range in, I bet you we would see a little less raising happening here on the turn. But versus 2/3 pot here, it is important to have a raise range on the turn. You can see that it is very polarized. It is 4x hands, 6x hands, and then a little bit of 6s and 4s because you block the straights. The sets actually do not even raise the turn here. You're basically raising straights or bluffs or hands with equity. Like I imagine there's going to be some flush draw type hands like 8-7 of diamonds, 8-7 of clubs. They're going to be raising here on the turn as well. But the big takeaway here, when you get check raised and you call in position and they barrel a turn that changes the texture where now you have more nuts than they do. It is important to use turn raises and to balance them out in a very polarized way between these strong hands like ace 4 and 6-4, which you can see are basically always raising, and then also work in a bunch of bluffs that block those hands for your opponent and have equity against their range. Hope that people stayed with me for that. Anyway, TJ does decide to just call the turn, which we do not love, and let's take the river.
For TJ.
A club would also be disaster.
Ooh, club. Got the dry ace.
He's in position. You know Doug's not going to slow down. Straight's too good not to still go for some more value. But when the bet comes in, will TJ go for it is the question, or just surrender?
That's 17.
Big pot brewing here. Will TJ fire with his dry ace?
Doesn't look like it, but he's going to mull it over. Exactly what he's thinking about here.
6,200.
There he goes.
Little jalapeno spice on hand number 101, baby.
Knows that Doug can't have the nuts because he's got the key ace of clubs.
Doug would love to have the 6 of clubs.
Well, I can just have flushes, and I could have a straight with a club.
4 of hearts, 6 of diamonds.
Yeah, 6-4. 6-4, no club.
TJ talking, bluffing. The boys have agreed to show. If they fold, the other player has to show 3
Lots
times.
of hands like to bluff here, though. That's the problem. And lots of hands like to bluff here.
I think he's calling, right?
I do.
You just have a club or 2 clubs.
The river comes to 7 of clubs, and we decide to bet here on the river about 2/3 pot. And TJ, after thinking it over for a little bit, bumps it up and makes it about 4x to go over my river bet, a little less than that, making it $6,200 over a $1,700 river bet, repping the flush here with the ace of clubs. So a lot of interesting stuff that's happening here. Let's just kind of unpack this one step at a time. Let's start by looking at my line that I take on the river. So to start off with, on rivers that change the board, or rather on rivers in general, you're going to have to split between a small size and a big size. Our small size on boards that change texture like this is going to be 1/3 pot, and our bigger size is going to be 2/3 pot. You might ask yourself, with 6-4, why would we want to go for your 2/3 pot size, Doug? The flush isn't that a little bit scary? But as you can see here, the solver only ever uses that 2/3 pot on the river. And the reason is because a straight still has a lot of hands it can get value from. If we bet 2/3 pot, our opponent's going to be forced to call us down with lots of 2-pair hands, pair plus club hands, ace 4 if you trap that. Oh, that's pretty rare. Sets, aces with a club, maybe queens with a club gets in there. There's a bunch of hands that we could think of that we'll call this river bet. It's much better to be betting here as we unblock lots of hands that can call. So solver is always betting 6-4 on this river, both 6-4s, and you can see it almost always uses that 2/3 pot size. So this is just slam dunk, absolutely the best possible line. I feel really good about how we played our hand so far. Over to TJ now with ace 9. Now, it's going to be a little tough to have good takeaways because you're not supposed to have ace 9 in your range here. You can see it there's no combinations, right? You're supposed to have folded the turn. So we're going to have to do a little bit of thinking about this when we're considering what the strategy should be. And we're going to start off with looking at what do our raises look like here? What hands are raising on this river? We can see that when we look at the whole range, we can see there is raising happening with lots of flushes. Any of these club hands are going to be raising. And you can raise more or less any flush on the river. So 6 deuce of clubs is raising. Every single flush all the way down raising. And nothing worse than a flush raises for value. So what hands get used as a bluff here? We can see king deuce with a club gets used. We can see king 6 with a club gets used. We can see all of these king X hands with a club get used. We can see all of these 9s get bluffed a bit with a club. 8s get bluffed a bit with a club. So let's talk about what's happening here. Now, I think that if the solver could have the ace of clubs, I would imagine it might use that a bit more often. But I could see some merit as to why the king of clubs is a bit better. As you get deeper, the suited aces tend to 3-bet more often, meaning there's not that many nut flushes in the big blind's range. So there are a lot more suited kings than suited aces when your opponent flats your preflop. This leads me to believe it's a bit better to actually block the king when we're going to bluff raise here than block the ace, because there are just not that many hands that your opponent can have when you have the ace, so the king is a better blocker. Now, I will say, when you're not sure which card is better, I think just as a default, using the ace to bluff when you get there is a good general theme. But if you start floating too wide to be able to bluff later with this card, you're going to end up over bluffing. And I think it is a bit better to be considering your opponent's defend range and really trying to pick out the card that makes the most sense to bluff with. So, long-winded way of saying it's better to bluff when you have a hand that's like, for example, king, jack, king of clubs, than it is to be bluffing with a hand that's, for example, like ace 5, which you could see the solver would never use. Now, that could also be because when you have ace 5, you block the pair. I don't know, but I imagine it's just simply more important to be blocking the king than it is blocking the ace. All right, so TJ does decide to go for it, slightly outside the range of where he should be going for it, but I do see why he picked this hand. It does make some sense. Back over to the big blind now. What do we do when we face this raise? And as shocking as this might be, 6-4 offsuit folds every single time. Now, we do not have many 6-4 offsuits, right? Because those are supposed to fold preflop. 6-4 suited also folds almost every single time unless you have clubs. That is a straight flush. I would recommend going all in. So 6-4 hearts, 6-4 spades, 6-4 diamonds actually likes calling a little bit of the time. So maybe there's a very low frequency call here for 6-4 with just the 6 of diamonds. But the point I made in the hand, and I said it in the hand, is that it's way better to call here when I have a diamond. Or sorry, when I have a club.
Well, I can just have flushes, and I could have a straight with a club.
Basically blocking those flushes. So you can see ace 4, when you have the club, is doing more calling. Ace 4 non-club actually does a little bit of calling too, for some reason I don't know. We can see what hands am I actually having very often here. It's mainly flushes. Like all of my flushes that check raise, barrel, and then bet river, they are all calling. And then my strong flushes really raise jam. If I did check raise and barrel with a hand with the ace of clubs, I'm using that to bluff. The big blind likes the ace of clubs to bluff more because you block more nut flushes than the small blind does when they have the ace of clubs. So anyway, the point is, if you look at all the hands that call, it is mainly flushes, a little bit of sets, but mainly you're just calling when you do have that club. So all in all, this is a nice spot to just let my hand go, which I decided to do. And I feel like other than a slightly too loose defend preflop, I do feel like I played this hand quite well. And that's the funny thing about heads up or poker in general. Sometimes you play your hand well and you still end up getting owned.
So, I think I'll use one of my goodness.
He's going to use it.
Ah, damn it. Couldn't I just have one club? God damn it.
He has one club. He's going to make the call.
Didn't call.
Leans full without a club in his hand.
People, but it's kind of like the 8-5 earlier, where it's just
Not the right hand.
it's really not the right hand.